There's a really interesting gospel in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, where the Lord talks about abiding. And specifically what he says is, abide in my love as I abide in my Father's love. Now you might hear that and think to yourself, well, gosh, like snooze fest, right? It sounds like a boring invitation to reflect on the nature of love, except there's actually a lot more to it. When it comes to this exhortation to abide in God's love, the first thing I want you to notice right off the bat is that it's very practical and purposeful. And so the whole point of this abiding in God's love is to live fruitful and joyful lives. But the second thing I want you to notice is that it's meant to be very specific and concrete. And so what the Lord says is that you abide in my love if you follow my commandments, which speaks to the fact that the invitation to go the way of Christian love is not simply an invitation to feel a certain way or to contemplate the nature of Christian love in the abstract, but instead it's this invitation to actively will the good of the other as other in a very specific and concrete sort of way. And so given all that, I thought it might be kind of helpful to give a short catechesis on a particular aspect of love, namely this notion of listening and accompaniment. And so when it comes to the notion of listening and accompaniment, the first thing that kind of comes to mind in terms of practical advice is to actually be interested in other people, as opposed to simply focusing on appearances. Because quite honestly, I think a lot of times we do precisely that. We focus on appearances, we focus on technique. Given the appearance that I care, given the appearance that I'm listening, by focusing on such things as eye contact, body language, active listening. And we forget this basic philosophical principle that doing flows from being. And so if I'm actually interested in other people, the appearance thing kind of takes care of itself. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember once speaking to a really good friend of mine who shared with me very provocatively that one of his pet peeves is when people say something like this: I hate pineapple on pizza. Because in his own words, a lot of times people are actually interested in things like putting chips in bottles. Now, in the face of it, that might sound like kind of a weird and almost nothing kind of comment, but in reality, there's a lot to it, right? And so my friend was basically suggesting that a lot of times people pretend that they're interested in things that they really don't care about, whereas in reality, they're actually afraid that they will ultimately be rejected if they speak from an honest place of actual passion and interest. As a result of which, the challenge, if you're actually listening to other people, is to subtly guide the conversation in such a way to encourage other people to be brave, to be courageous in terms of speaking from their authentic place of interest and passion. As a result of which, you're not making small talk anymore, but instead you're actually having a meaningful conversation about things that matter. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. But the second thing that comes to mind when it comes to the notion of listening is to allow your listening to inform your thought process and therefore your speech. And so to illustrate the point, I remember back in the day talking to a priest friend of mine about the sacrament of confession. And as he tells the story, one time he was hearing someone's confession, and he was so worried about saying the right thing once the penitent was done that he really wasn't listening to what the penitent was saying. And then all of a sudden the penitent was done, and he totally forgot what the confession was all about. And he realized in retrospect what he should have done was simply focus on the confession, to simply listen to what the penitent was saying and trust that eventually when it came time for him to speak, he would know what to say. Kenneth Burke, this literary theorist, he talks about the same point in a slightly different sort of way. Now, to be fair, this particular analogy is often used to illustrate the dynamics of academic discourse, but it also applies to this thing we're talking about here. In any case, what he says is, imagine you arrive late to a cocktail party. And so the prudent thing to do is to not speak right away, but instead to listen to what's being said, to compare and contrast what's being said to what you know and what you think you know. And then eventually when the time is right, that's when you speak. And because you've been listening attentively, the result is that your speech is now edifying. You're able to make a meaningful contribution to the conversation because, again, you've been listening and you've been allowing your listening to inform your thought process and ultimately your speech. One final point, I'll kind of end with this. And this is kind of a subtle point, but I think you'll kind of grasp this, right? So basically the idea is that you need to recognize that listening is not simply a task to be done, but instead it's a mode of accompaniment, a mode of journeying with, if you will. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember once going to dinner with this young lady who was a professional model, which is actually kind of essential to the story. In any case, the reason why we were having dinner is because a mutual friend knew that she was thinking about being a lawyer. He knew that I was a lawyer, and so he thought that I might be able to give her advice in terms of next steps, in terms of her potential career. Anyways, early on in the dinner, I remember asking her, why do you want to be a lawyer? In response to which, she didn't really talk about her love for the law, but instead she talked about a particular scenario in her life. And so basically what she said was that back in the day, she was working reception. And then she did some work for someone in the office, as a result of which that certain someone said to her, hey, look, you're really smart. Maybe you should be a lawyer. And I thought about it for a second. I kind of said to her, it sounds like you don't really want to be a lawyer. It sounds like you just want to be affirmed for something other than your physical beauty. As a result of which she became really emotional, and funny enough, she thought that we should date. Now, for my part, I thought that was a bad idea for two reasons. Partially because I was already discerning a potential call to the priesthood, but also because in reality, we had nothing in common. But the point still remains that, isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that this person, this young lady, thought that we had this potentially interesting romantic connection simply because I had asked her a question and simply listened to the answer? She thought we had this thing simply because I showed some interest in her as a person and as an individual. And so, depending on how you look at it, it's interesting, but it's also kind of sad. It really speaks to the fact that there's so many people out there in the world who don't really feel seen and known and loved. They don't feel heard, which in turn issues to us as a Christian people a certain challenge to listen better to other people. Now, you might hear that and think, well, gosh, I don't have time to do this, but that's the point, right? Listening is not a function of time. It's not a task to be done. It's not a task to be accomplished. It's a state of mind. Listening is a form of accompaniment and journeying with, where I make space in my heart to be with the other person, to journey with the other person, to make them feel seen and known and loved, to let them know I am with you, to help you truly become the person that God is calling you to be. And may God bless you all.